and I will be serving as your moderator for tonight. So on behalf of the League and all of our co-sponsors, I just want to welcome you. How many of you are in this building and in this room for the first time? Quite a few people. Well, we're really delighted to be here, and we would like to thank Dr. Mina Carson for making the room arrangements and for serving as our audiovisual wizard tonight and being here to help us take care of all kinds of AV problems we might be having. So, here we go. We really appreciate your help, and we want to acknowledge that Dr. Carson is part of the School of History, Religion, and Philosophy, and they are our major co-sponsors this evening, so thank you so much. Okay, and doing videotaping too, so if you know some folks who wanted to be here tonight who could not be, it is being recorded, so they'll be able to see it later. We would also like to thank Chris Paul for her wonderful poster design and all the volunteers who have helped with tonight's program. As communities across the country begin to grapple with the impacts of climate change, state-level policymakers are exploring economic tools to encourage reduction of carbon emissions. And here in Oregon, the state legislature passed Senate Bill 306 in 2013, authorizing a study of the feasibility of implementing a clean air tax statewide as a new revenue option that would augment or replace portions of existing revenues. So another name for clean air tax is carbon tax, and that is the topic that we will focus on tonight. Recent polls show that 7 in 10 voters see climate change as a serious problem facing our country, and people are ready to talk about it and to look for solutions. The purpose of tonight's program is to educate and also to motivate. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. And we have organized tonight's program because we know that action is urgently needed to reduce carbon emissions, and we would like to know more about the options for doing so. We know that by cutting carbon emissions and moving toward clean, renewable energy, we can build stronger, safer communities. But how can we accelerate current efforts to move in that direction? At last June's National Convention, the League of Women Voters in the U.S. voted to support a price on carbon emissions, a price that will increase in stages yet be rapid enough to save the climate system. And we're curious to explore whether a carbon tax in Oregon is a viable option. And we have 19 co-sponsors that have joined with us in promoting this evening's exploration. We would like to thank all of our co-sponsors with their help promoting this event, and many of our co-sponsors have tables out in the lobby, and if you haven't already had a chance to visit them, we hope you'll do so after the program. There's plenty of seating down in front still if you guys want to move forward. So here's our agenda for the evening. First, we will hear from our presenters, and we have put together what we think is a really stellar panel, which includes Nancy Shurtz from the University of Oregon Law School, Dr. Jenny Liu and Jeff Renfro from the Northwest Economic Research Center at Portland State University, and Kristin Eberhard of Sightline Institute. And we really thank you all so much for being here tonight. We're going to hear first from Nancy Shurtz, who is a professor at the University of Oregon Law School. She holds degrees from the University of Cincinnati, Ohio State, and Georgetown University. Professor Shurtz joined the U of O Law School faculty from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. She is an expert in business tax law, tax policy, and environmental policy. Professor Shurtz is going to give us an overview, sort of a carbon tax 101, kind of set the stage.
All right, so let's turn to the first slide. This is the organization of my presentation tonight. And I do think carbon taxes are a great way to fight climate change, and particularly on the state level. So I'm going to start out with what are the sources of carbon. I'm going to turn to why not a cap and trade system as opposed to a carbon tax. I'm going to talk about how do you get to the details of the right kind of carbon tax, what are the barriers to implementation, and then overcoming the barriers. So if you look at this chart here, we've got to think about what the sources of the carbon emissions are. We look at the different sectors and we look at the numbers. So if you look at right here, the 32%, you see that quite a lot of carbon comes from gas and diesel. So if you're targeting a tax, or actually even thinking about cap and trade, you need to think about who's going to bear the burden, where is it going to be imposed? Is it going to be imposed upstream, big generators, or downstream at the gas stations, things like that. So we need to look at what we think a fair system would be, but overall this is the general coal, oil, natural gas, carbon pollution. Okay? So if we look at the comparison between cap and trade and carbon tax, and this has been debated on the federal level, but nothing's happened really there. Although President Obama has really favored the cap and trade, environmentalists actually favor the cap and trade. Many economists, however, and we have some esteemed economists on the panel today, believe that a carbon tax, and I do too, as a tax person I think the carbon tax is better. Over here with the cap and trade, I think why the environmentalists prefer it is that you do set the level of emissions. So the positive thing is you set the level of emissions. Over here on the carbon tax side, no, we just set the price, the tax. And now that's politically determined and oftentimes not high enough to have effective environmental behavior. So you can see where environmentalists want us to set the behavior and stop the pollution. Whereas over here, the price is certain, and actually businesses like that better because they know that the price is certain. And technically, you can change an environmental tax and make the tax higher to affect the behavior you want. Over here, you have to determine the quantity of allowances, and this is hard. You have to determine how you start out, and then is it auctioned, is it free, and you have to monitor and then set up this market. So it actually is much more complicated. It's much more subject to gaming. And it might produce revenue if you didn't grandfather those people in, if you did auction them off. But still, over here, we do have to monitor, so that's the same. We do have to monitor the emissions. But it seems to be much more straightforward and much simpler over here. We're not concerned with the set level of emissions. It's easier to administer. And we're always going to generate revenue, whereas over here, if we grandfather it in, we're not going to generate revenue. And actually, I don't know if the economists can speak to the European system, but actually there's been a failure over here of cap and trade. Both of these, by the way, are market mechanisms, all right? Both of them are. It's just that, I found a study, interestingly, that the carbon tax is actually more efficient. And so this came out of the Congressional Budget Office, which basically estimated that a carbon tax would produce net benefits 5 times those of the cap and trade. The argument is cap and trade is inflexible, but carbon taxes continuously encourage these emission reductions, and that the taxes are straightforward to administer. They're a lot less subject to gaming. The price is known, and it's not a volatile price, and that it creates revenue. So we'll see from the economists what they think, but I think at the bottom, I think it's time for a state like Oregon that doesn't have a sales tax to act in this regard and to serve as a model for the federal government and the nation. So that's what I'm arguing. But the devil, as we say, is in the details. And like I say, what do you think is more important? Do you think achieving an exact level of emissions reductions, and that would be more like the cap and trade, or do we want to send a message about carbon emissions in general by making the polluter pay? And of course, that's a tricky one, because if the incidence is at the gas tank, or if it's in your electric bill, then I think you can understand it. But if it's just passed on indirectly through the electric companies, then maybe it might be harder. As far as the level of state regulatory involvement goes, I think that we already have in place a sophisticated tax system, and I think we have a gas tax system. I think that it wouldn't be that hard. It's not like setting up an exchange and having tradable permits. So the revenue, though, is an interesting one. If you look around the world, you'll see that all three of these models are used. So for instance, some people believe that the revenue, this is very important, where does the revenue go? Sometimes the revenue should, in Finland and some of the Norwegian countries, the revenue just goes into the general fund, all right? I'm not a big fan of that myself. The second one I actually like a lot. They earmark it for environmentally good things. Boulder has a tax, and theirs goes into remissions, and so does San Francisco. So they're earmarked for innovation and mitigation, carbon mitigation. So I like that because I have this environmental hat where I think, yeah, that's good. Let's put it there. However, I also have an equity hat, all right? And if the incidence of the gas and the electric bills go on to the low-income groups, then I'm thinking we might want to use some of the revenue for those groups. Now, you'll hear this jargon about revenue neutral and revenue shifting and the British Columbia tax, which I'm going to talk about later, where they not only take the revenue and subsidize low-income groups, but they recycle it and circulate it to low-income businesses, small businesses, and even large businesses. And interestingly, that system has a negative revenue because if you look at it overall, you might say it should be revenue neutral, but what happens there is that they're shifting the burden off some of the low income and the smaller business and other businesses, and essentially they're not generating any other revenue. They're losing money overall, and so they obviously aren't earmarking anything for innovative environmental issues. But this is real important. What are we going to do with the revenue, okay? And then who bears the burden? Very important. Businesses bear the burden. Individuals bear the burden. So how does that mix and how does that work? And then lastly, how will the tax be imposed? So number one, it's kind of simple. You have to pick, what sector are we going to tax? What are the products we're going to tax? Gas and diesel and propane. Are we going to be taxing big utility companies? Who are we going to tax? What is the rate? And then, what's the way to implement it? So there are some devilish details that you have to think about when you do this. Okay. Next slide. So I think one of the biggest barriers to this, at least it has been on the national level, because I think nothing happens. I don't know about now, after all the Republicans winning, but there has been in the past like nothing. And so there's this political aversion, right, to new taxes. And I think that's a big stumbling block. And maybe one would say that given our sales tax history in Oregon, where repeatedly this has been raised but always failed, this might not have a very good chance of passing. However, I think it could, because we're very progressive in this state, and we don't have a sales tax. And I think we need a diverse, balanced way of raising revenue. The way to do that, of course, is property tax, and then sales tax, perhaps, and then income tax. Well, we don't have a sales tax, but what about a carbon tax? How about that? I think it works. Okay, I think it would work. Now, the economics, I'm going to defer that to our panel here, but some economic studies have shown that it's not going to hurt economic growth and that there are a lot of companies that aren't going to be at a competitive disadvantage. But that's a very important point, and along with these efficacy issues. In other words, how can this effectively promote carbon reduction, I guess? And that depends on the rate and the base. And then the other issue here is, from an effective point of view, it's not an economic effective. It's just that, can Oregon, by passing this carbon tax, be an effective leader in the United States? I mean, if it were California, I hate to say that, but they're bigger, that might work. I wish it could, and I would hope that if we could pass one, we could be a leader for the United States. And then, of course, the equity issues are very important to me because that's my equity hat. All right. Okay, so if you look around the United States, there's no state in the United States that has a carbon tax. I mean, there's a lot of fees and other things, emission fees, but no carbon tax. There is, however, in Boulder, Colorado, and in San Francisco, California. And the next couple of slides I'm going to go into those particular programs. I think that they're not as good as British Columbia. So I think the model that I see, we're so close to British Columbia, really. I mean, It's Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and this is the model for me. So when I look at them, I think, wow, they've done it right, pretty much. They don't make any revenues though, and maybe they don't earmark it like I want them to, but they do it better than the others. Okay, so let's look at the others for a while. Okay, so Boulder, Colorado is very interesting. Theirs was effective in 2007, and basically the rates are very, very low, okay, and they're on the use of electricity. However, they have an exemption because the electricity companies there have a lot of wind power. So if you get your electricity from wind, you're exempt from this particular tax. So it's very small. It's like 0.00. I mean, I've got the rates up there. See, they're 0.0049. That's nothing. So the rates aren't very good. The other thing is that this Boulder, I don't know if you're familiar with Boulder. It's very, liberal, pretty rich, sort of elite, not the typical American, right? So it is true that they do make quite a bit of money from this. In 2012, it was 1.23 million. Okay, and it is true that that fund goes to promote energy efficiency, green buildings, renewable energy. And so what's interesting about the Boulder, because they are very liberal, and I kind of like the idea that they're earmarking it for innovative green stuff. And maybe the community is such that they don't have a lot of low-income taxpayers. But if they did, then I might think the revenue should go a different way. Okay? Now, San Francisco, I think, is a little bit better. Why? Because I think the rates are a little bit higher. This is imposed on a very limited group, 780 permitted facilities, that produce, electricity, industrial sector, and the revenue is 1.1 million. However, the rate up there is very, again, a little bit higher than Boulder, but not very high at all. And so, again, like Boulder, they use the money to support local efforts for renewable energy, administrative stuff, and things like that. So I think that's better. But I think the next slide, I think Boulder, I think that's the model for us, really. So I think that British Columbia, British Columbia is the best model for us. It's a province in Canada, and they have a pretty high rate. Now it's $30, although it's Canada dollars. Per metric ton. They also tax all sorts of fuels. They tax, the gas, and they tax propane and heating oil. They also tax natural gas. So they tax a huge amount of fuels. The base is huge. The rate is high. Okay, and they do have some interesting exceptions. They have rail, air, and marine is accepted if it's international commerce because they don't want to hurt the competition up there. And then they use the money, interestingly, to sort of recycle, what we call recycle. So what they're doing is they're reducing the rates on the poorer people, and they're giving them a tax credit, and they're also reducing rates on small businesses and businesses. The other thing that they did, which is very interesting, that they gave every household $100 Canadian when they first started this program. Because what they're trying to say, I think, is, look, this might impose a burden on you as a household, and what we want to do is let you know that we want you to stop your activity that might hurt global warming, and here we are giving you a subsidy, everybody a subsidy regardless of whether you're wealthy or not. So I think that was a signaling device that I think is very good. So the unfortunate thing that I don't like about it is that there's not a lot of revenue being earmarked for innovative environmental things. But other than that, the rates are high, the base is broad, and I think the impact has, we'll have to look at the economists, but I don't think the impact has been that bad. In fact, if you look at this province and compare it to other provinces that don't have a carbon tax, I think there's 2 other provinces up there that do. My understanding is that there hasn't been a significant environmental impact negatively from this tax. All right, so these are just the lessons that I think that we can learn maybe from carbon tax. Make it simple, make it easy to administer, raise adequate revenue and use the revenue appropriately, try to lower the impact of the tax on lower and middle classes, try not to adversely impact the economy, which is our speakers coming up, make it effective, okay? Make it high enough, effective, so that people can change their behavior and that the environment can be protected. And then just in conclusion, Just in conclusion, I think an Oregon state carbon tax might not impact climate change globally, okay, but it could make a regional difference. I think an Oregon state carbon tax would generate revenues that could be used for innovative environmental initiatives at the same time as lessening the impact of the tax on the poor. And I think an environmental state carbon tax could serve as a model to other states and also to the federal government and even to foreign governments. And I know, quite frankly, it's time to confront climate change. Thanks.
Thank you.